The mammals that would fill the forests, the birds that would sing in the air, the plants that would evolve into the landscapes we know. The visitor from the void had brought destruction, but it had also cleared the way for a new story. The earth in its vastness turned tragedy into renewal. Above the planet, the stars continued to burn, silent and distant, unaware of what had happened to one small world among billions. The asteroid belt from which the visitor had come remained. Other fragments drifted still, their orbits crossing paths that might one day intersect again. But for now, the void was quiet. The earth spun slowly beneath the remnants of its own fire, waiting for the light to return. And when it did, faint and golden through the clearing air, the planet looked unchanged to the universe. It still glowed blue and white and green. It still turned under the same sun, but everything upon it had changed forever. It began as a bright streak across a clear sky, a line of light that moved too fast for the eye to follow, too silent to warn what was coming. For the creatures below, it was nothing more than a passing brightness, a curiosity glimpse between the leaves or reflected in still water. The herds didn't stop feeding. The birds didn't stop calling. The air was warm and full of life. Yet in that same moment, the balance that had lasted for millions of years was about to disappear. The day the sky fell was not a slow unraveling. It was a single instant when everything changed. The asteroid entered the atmosphere at 70,000 kA. It was already glowing white-hot, its surface vaporizing as it met the resistance of air. The friction produced a column of plasma that stretched from space to the ground, heating the air to thousands of degrees. Before it even touched the Earth, shock waves rippled outward, flattening the sky itself. And then, in a flash shorter than a heartbeat, the asteroid struck. The point of impact was a shallow sea in what would one day be the Yucatan Peninsula. The explosion released energy equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The asteroid itself was obliterated instantly, its mass converted into heat and shock. The ground at the impact site vaporized. Rock melted and flowed like liquid. The air turned to fire. The pressure wave expanded outward faster than sound, tearing through the atmosphere in all directions. If you were anywhere within 1,000 kilometers, you would not have seen it. Only light so intense it burned before you could look away. The forests ignited instantly. Trees vaporized into flame. Animals caught in the open disintegrated where they stood. Even hundreds of kilometers from the impact, the blast flattened everything in its path. The wave moved at supersonic speed, tearing the air apart, creating winds more powerful than any storm in the planet's history. The shock continued through the ground, triggering earthquakes across continents. Mountains quivered. Rivers changed direction. The crust of the earth flexed like a drum. The sea itself was lifted, displaced outward, sending waves hundreds of meters high, racing across the globe. Coastlines vanished. Islands disappeared beneath walls of water. The entire planet shook as if the core itself had been struck. Above, Thesky was a furnace. The impact had thrown trillions of tons of molten rock and vapor into space. For a moment, the planet was surrounded by a halo of glowing debris, a ring of incandescent dust that encircled the Earth. Much of it fell back within hours, re-entering the atmosphere as a rain of fire. These fragments, some no larger than grains of sand, heated the air through friction. The entire upper atmosphere burned. From pole to pole, the air glowed red-orange, and the surface of the planet was bathed in infrared heat strong enough to ignite forests across continents. Even those far from the blast felt the heat. Temperatures at ground level rose suddenly, not from sunlight, but from the atmosphere itself. Plants curled and blackened. Animals fled in confusion, seeking shade where there was none to be found. The fires spread rapidly, merging into vast infernos that consumed everything from coast to mountain. Smoke rose in colossal plumes, joining the dust and vapor already filling the air. Within hours, the sky that had been bright blue turned dark and turbulent. At sea, the devastation took a different form. The impact had vaporized the shallow waters of the Gulf, sending superheated steam into the atmosphere. The waves that followed were immense, traveling at the speed of a jet. When they reached other shores, the coasts of North America, Africa, Europe, they were still tens of meters high. The force of the water scoured everything in its path, carving new shorelines and depositing sediments that would one day become layers of rock, silent records of the flood. The creatures of the ocean suffered as well. The initial blast boiled the water near the impact site. Everything within hundreds of kilometers was cooked instantly. Further out, the waves churned the seas, stirring up sediments and driving oxygen from the water. Marine life that had survived the heat soon faced suffocation. Coral reefs shattered. The great marine reptiles that had ruled the oceans for millions of years, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, were thrown into chaos. The shock wave disoriented them, ruptured their organs, broke their world apart. The air, once filled with the sounds of insects and birds, fell silent. The fires burned through forests that had stood for centuries. The smell of smoke and burning resin filled the atmosphere. The planet's great carbon stores, the trees, the soil, the vegetation, released their gases in one vast exhalation. The sky, now thick with soot and ash, began to block the sun. Within days, the light faded. At first, it was a dimming. The sun shrouded as if by thick clouds. Then, over weeks, the light weakened further. The atmosphere loaded with dust, sulfur, and carbon became nearly opaque. Day and night merged into a perpetual twilight. Temperatures fell rapidly. Rain began to fall, mixed with ash and acid, washing soot into rivers and seas. This was the beginning of the long darkness, an impact winter that would last for years. In that darkness, the survivors clung to what warmth they could find. Small mammals stayed in burrows. Their metabolism slowed, feeding on stored food or scavenging what they could. Some birds sought shelter in hollows and caves, waiting for light to return. Crocodiles and turtles, protected by their ability to live in cold water and go long periods without food, endured insolence. Insects and worms continued their work underground, breaking down the dead. Life reduced to embers waited for the fire to pass. Above the ground, the fires continued to burn wherever oxygen and fuel remained. The glow of flames flickered faintly through the thick haze, reflecting off clouds of smoke that wrapped the planet. The heat trapped beneath those clouds alternated with the cold above, creating turbulent winds that spread soot across every continent. The world became a furnace followed by a freezer, a cycle of extremes no creature had ever known. In some places, volcanic activity increased in the aftermath. Impact had disturbed the crust so deeply that it triggered eruptions thousands of kilometers away. The Deccan traps, already active, flared with new intensity, pouring more gases into the air. The combination of impact debris and volcanic emissions filled the atmosphere with sulfur aerosols that reflected sunlight and cooled the Earth even further. The temperature drop was sudden, perhaps by more than 10 degrees C within months. The plants died first without sunlight. Photosynthesis stopped. Leaves fell. Seeds waited in vain for warmth to return. The lush green world that had fed the dinosaurs vanished. Herbivores starved, their skeletons scattered in the ash. Predators followed, their dominance meaningless without prey. The ecosystems that had taken millions of years to build collapsed in months. The oceans, deprived of sunlight, suffered too. Phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that formed the base of marine food webs, could no longer survive in the darkened waters. With them gone, everything above them starved. Fish, ammonites, marine reptiles all declined rapidly. The once living seas turned still. And yet, even in that silence, life persisted. Some forms of plankton survived in deeper waters, feeding on chemicals rising from the ocean floor. Bacteria thrived around volcanic vents using heat and minerals to sustain themselves. On land, spores and seeds lay dormant, waiting for the chance to sprout. The planet was wounded but not dead. The impact dust took years to settle. Each day, less sunlight reached the surface. Each night, the cold deepened. Glaciers formed briefly near the poles. Rain turned to snow, even in regions that had once been tropical. The Earth entered a kind of suspended state. Neither alive nor lifeless, a world in recovery from trauma. The air was thin and acrid. The ground was littered with ash. The oceans were dark and cold. But beneath the surface, beneath the ruins of the biosphere, life's mechanisms continued their quiet work. Eventually, gravity and time began to clear the sky. The larger particles fell first, creating layers of clay that would one day mark this event in stone. The fine dust lingered longer, keeping the world dim but no longer black. Slowly, over years, the light returned. The first sunrise after the impact would have been faint, filtered through haze, the sun a dull orange disk instead of the brilliant gold it once was. But even that light was enough to begin renewal. The surviving plants responded first. Seeds that had lain buried began to germinate. Ferns were among the first to return, their spores spreading quickly across the barren land. Fossil records show what paleontologists call a fern spike. Layers of fossilized spores marking the brief dominance of ferns in the years after the impact. They grew when nothing else could, stabilizing soil and preparing it for the forest that would come later. With the plants returned, the air changed again. Oxygen levels began to rise. Small insects reappeared. The smallest mammals, those that had survived in burrows and hollows, ventured out. They fed on insects, roots, and carrion. The world was quiet, subdued, stripped of its giants, but it was alive again. The earth did not recover evenly. Some regions remained wastelands for centuries. Others rebounded more quickly. The patterns of rainfall and temperature had shifted permanently. Entire ecosystems were gone, replaced by new ones that evolved from the remnants. The world that emerged was familiar but altered, a reset planet. The day the sky fell had ended the age of the dinosaurs, but it had not ended life. It had forced it to change, to begin again under new rules. The survivors became the ancestors of everything that would follow. The mammals that would diversify into new forms. The birds that would carry the legacy of the dinosaurs into the future. The plants that would rebuild the green world from its ashes. The sky that had once been filled with fire cleared eventually. The stars returned, dim at first, then bright again. The same constellations that the dinosaurs had unknowingly lived beneath shone on a new world, one quieter, colder, and smaller, but full of potential. The Earth had endured another transformation, as it always had, and the memory of that day would remain in its rocks forever. In the stillness that followed, the planet spun on, its hidden pulse unchanged. The crust cooled. The seas calmed. The atmosphere settled. The ashes fell like snow, covering the bones of the titans and the ruins of the forests. Time began its slow work of forgetting. What had been a single day of destruction would become, in the language of geology, a thin line between ages. The moment when one world ended and another began. The day the sky fell was the end of everything that had been familiar for over 100 million years. Yet in that ending, the seeds of all future life had already been sown. The sunlight returned, faint but real, and the earth, as it always does, began to heal. After the fire and the thunder faded, after the shock waves stopped echoing through the crust, there was silence. The planet, once full of movement and sound, had gone still. The fires that had swept across the continents had burned everything they could reach. The skies were thick and dark, filled with smoke and ash that blotted out the sun. The air was heavy with the scent of soot and minerals. The residue of forest turned to dust. This was the beginning of the long night. For days, the world remained dim. The sky a dull red-brown that never brightened. Then even that faded to gray and finally to black. The sunlight could no longer penetrate. The clouds of dust and debris suspended high in the stratosphere. Across every continent, temperatures began to drop. The air that had been hot enough to ignite wood now cooled faster than the surviving creatures could adapt. The warmth of the Cretaceous vanished in weeks, replaced by a deep, unrelenting chill. The long night after the impact was not simply darkness. It was absence of light, of heat, of sound. The forest stood as blackened skeletons, their trunks stripped of bark and leaves. The seas reflected nothing. The wind moved in slow, irregular currents, carrying fine ash that settled in layers across the land. Each particle was a memory of what had burned. In that darkness, the rhythm of life slowed to almost nothing. The great dinosaurs that had dominated the planet were gone. Their bones lay buried in the ash, still warm from the fires that had consumed them. The giants that had fed on trees, the predators that had ruled the plains, the creatures of the sea-sand skies, all had vanished. What remained was a planet emptied of its familiar voices. Yet not all life ended. Some forms had found shelter before the firestorm. In burrows beneath the earth, small mammals huddled together, their bodies pressed for warmth. They lived on stored seeds, on roots, on the remains of insects that had also hidden underground. Their metabolism slowed to conserve energy, their hearts beating in rhythm with the fading warmth of the soil. They were not the rulers of this world. Not yet. They were its survivors. In the water, crocodiles and turtles endured, their slow bodies suited to starvation and cold. They could remain motionless for months, waiting. Amphibians burrowed into the mud of dried lakes, their skin absorbing what little moisture remained. Insects, always resilient, retreated into the cracks of stone and bark, their eggs sealed against the cold. Bacteria and fungi thrived on the vast decay that now covered the earth. Life did not stop. It only withdrew, conserving itself insolence. The oceans had turned dark and acidic. The debris from the impact rained down for months, mixing with the water, forming carbonic acid that corroded shells and coral. The upper layers of the sea, once alive with plankton, grew empty. The food chains collapsed. Only in the depths, near volcanic vents, did ecosystems remain stable. There, far below the reach of sunlight, chemosynthetic life continued. Bacteria feeding on minerals and heat, forming the foundation for worms, crustaceans, and strange creatures adapted to the darkness. They had no need for the sun. Their world was ancient, self-contained, untouched by the chaos above. On land, the ash settled in thick blankets, smothering what had survived the flames. Rivers clogged with silt and debris, their waters turning sluggish and opaque. The air, once warm and heavy with the scent of plants, smelled now of sulfur and whetstone. Acid rain fell steadily, washing the soot from the atmosphere, but poisoning the ground in the process. Lakes turned black. The first snow fell soon after, fine and gray mixed with ash, covering the world in a strange stillness. The long night stretched into months. In some places, the darkness was so complete that even the stars were invisible. The atmosphere was choked, with dust high enough to scatter starlight before it reached the ground. Creatures that once relied on sight moved clumsily through the dark, guided by smell, touch, or memory. Many failed to find food or shelter and died quietly, their bodies becoming part of the new soil forming across the world. The silence that followed was absolute. There were no calls of birds, no rustling of leaves, no hum of insects. The only sounds were wind and the distant cracking of cooling rock. The earth seemed suspended between its old life and the new one that had not yet begun. The planet still turned beneath the shroud of dust, but its rotation brought no dawn, no warmth, no color. Time continued, but the distinction between day and night was gone. In this darkness, the survivors evolved behaviors that would define their descendants. Some mammals learned to dig deeper, extending their tunnels to find warmth and protection. Others began to forage in the ashes, feeding on carcasses left by the fires. Their senses sharpened. Smell, hearing, touch, adapting to a world where sight was almost useless. These instincts would endure long after the darkness lifted. The small reptiles that survived did so by patience. Their metabolism slowed to a near halt. They could survive on almost nothing, conserving energy through stillness. Birds that had adapted to eat seeds outlived those that relied on insects or fruit. The first true avian survivors of this catastrophe were those whose diets and behavior matched the conditions of scarcity, the ancestors of the birds we know today. The Earth cooled further. Without sunlight, the planet's energy balance collapsed. The heat, once trapped by the atmosphere, escaped into space. Snow spread from the poles toward the equator, not in deep drifts, but in thin, persistent layers that reflected what little light remained. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees. The Cretaceous warmth was gone. The age of greenhouse air had ended, replaced by a chill that reached even the deepest valleys. Fossil evidence from this time reveals the extent of the collapse. In the sedimentary layers that mark the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, there is a thin band rich in iridium, a metal rare on Earth but common in asteroids. Below it lie the remains of the Old World. Abundant fossils, traces of plants, diverse microfauna. Above it, for a time almost nothing. A silence recorded in stone. The long night left its shadow not only in life, but in the Earth itself. And yet, even as the cold deepened, the planet began to recover in small, imperceptible ways. The dust that had blocked the sun slowly began to settle. The heaviest particles fell first, forming layers of clay that blanketed the ground. Lighter ash lingered longer, drifting across oceans and continents before sinking into the soil. The air cleared gradually, enough for a dime-orange light to filter through the haze. It was not bright, but it was something. The first sunrise after months of darkness would have been strange, weak, distorted, but real. For the survivors, it marked a turning point. With light came warmth, though faint and inconsistent. The snow began to melt in patches. Streams reappeared, carrying black water thick with soot. Seeds that had lain dormant began to stir. Ferns were the first to return. Their spores spread easily, carried by wind and water, germinating in the nutrient-rich ash. They covered the barren ground in soft green within a few seasons. A living carpet that captured sunlight and restored oxygen to the air. The fossil record shows this phase clearly. An overwhelming dominance of ferns marking the first recovery of plant life. Where ferns grew, insects followed. Beetles, flies, and ants emerged from hiding, feeding on decaying matter and new growth. Spiders returned to the shadows, spinning webs between the skeletal remains of fallen trees. The air filled once again with motion, faint at first, then more constant. Each returning insect marked a step toward renewal. Small mammals ventured out from their burrows, their eyes squinted in the weak light, their noses twitching at unfamiliar scents. The world they found was unrecognizable, silent, gray, and empty, but it belonged to them now. They fed on insects, roots, and the occasional carcass. Some climbed the stumps of burned trees, exploring the open space that had once been dense forest. The absence of larger predators gave them freedom they had never known. Birds followed, emerging from hidden nests. Those that survived the long night began to spread, feeding on seeds and small prey. Their calls returned to the air, tentative at first, then stronger. Sound began to fill the silence again. The earth was waking slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably. The oceans were slower to heal. Took centuries for the chemistry of the water to stabilize. Once the dust settled and sunlight penetrated the surface again, phytoplankton began to reappear. Their return was the beginning of everything. From them came oxygen, food, and balance. The first blooms were small, patchy, but within a few thousand years they had spread across the seas once more. The marine world followed the same quiet pattern as the land. Slow revival, small steps, resilience born of simplicity. Even as life returned, the planet was different. The climate was cooler, the air thinner, the sunlight sharper after passing through an altered atmosphere. The lush humidity of the Cretaceous was gone. In its place came a world of seasons, of contrast. Wet and dry, cold and warm. The balance that had allowed the great reptiles to thrive was broken forever. In its absence, something new began to take shape. The mammals, once small and unremarkable, began to change. With no giant predators to keep them in check, they diversified quickly. Some grew larger, others specialized, digging, climbing, swimming. Their intelligence and adaptability became the tools of survival in a world that no longer rewarded size but versatility. Evolution moved faster now, filling the empty spaces left behind by the dinosaurs. The long night, which had seemed endless, gave way to a slow dawn. The sun rose higher each day. The air cleared. The plants grew taller. Forest began to return, though they were not the same as before. New species of flowering plants took root, spreading across continents. The world had reset. Its ecosystems rebuilt from the simplest survivors upward. In the layers of rock that record this time, there is no clear line between destruction and renewal. The two are intertwined. The same processes that ended one age made the next possible. The fire that destroyed the forests enriched the soil for the new ones. The cold that wiped out species made room for others better suited to change. The silence that followed the impact was not just an ending. It was space for the beginning that followed. From space, the Earth would have looked normal again long before life fully recovered. The clouds cleared, the oceans shone blue, the continents green slowly. But beneath that surface, the structure of the living world had been rewritten. The long night after the impact had ended, an era that had lasted for 160 million years. What came after would be something entirely different. And even as the world warmed again, even as forests returned and animals multiplied, traces of that night remained everywhere. In the soil, in the oceans, in the DNA of every survivor. There was memory, not of fear or pain, but of endurance. The planet had passed through fire and shadow and come out changed. Smaller, quieter, but still alive. The long night was over, but its echo continued in the rhythm of seasons, in the adaptation of species, in the understanding that even the greatest empires of life are temporary. The earth kept turning, Thesan rose higher, and the survivors carried the story forward, unaware of the age they were about to create. When the light finally returned to the earth, it revealed a world unrecognizable from the one that had come before. The long night had stripped the planet bare, leaving behind a canvas of ash and stone. The forests were gone, the seas were quieter, and the air was thinner and cooler. What life remained moved slowly, cautiously, as though testing the edges of survival itself. The giants had vanished, their bones buried in the new soil forming from layers of dust and time. What remained were the survivors, the small, the quiet, the unnoticed. They were not the rulers of this new world, not yet. They were its remnants, its inheritors by chance and resilience. In the stillness that followed extinction, the future belonged to those who could endure the emptiness. The world's pulse had not stopped, but it beat more softly now, measured and faint beneath the shifting crust. And upon that subdued earth, life began to rebuild. The first signs of recovery were faint, almost invisible. Ferns spread quickly across the land, their spores carried by wind into every open space. They grew in thick mats over Thiesh, their roots stabilizing the fragile soil. Their return gave the planet a new shade of green, duller, lower to the ground, but alive. Insects returned soon after, feeding on decay and new vegetation. Beetles, ants, and flies adapted easily to the cooler air and the new plants. With them came spiders and other small predators, rebuilding the lower layers of the food chain. The foundations of ecosystems formed again quietly, unnoticed by any eye that could see their importance. The animals that had survived the impact came out cautiously. They were creatures of the edges, borrowers, scavengers, opportunists. The world they emerged into was one of silence and opportunity. With the great predators gone, no single species dominated. Each pocket of life grew according to what the environment would allow. And in that openness, evolution found new directions to explore. Mammals were among the most successful survivors. Before the impact, they had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs, small nocturnal creatures that fed mostly on insects, seeds, or eggs. They had learned how to hide, how to adapt quickly, how to survive with little. These were the traits that saved them. In a world of scarcity, they could live on almost anything. Their ability to regulate body temperature, their intelligence, and their social behavior gave them advantages in a landscape that had lost its stability. Most of these early mammals were small, no larger than rats or rabbits. They lived in burrows or crevices, venturing out only when necessary. Some species fed on insects, others on plants or carrion. Fossil evidence suggests that many of them were generalists, able to shift their diets depending on what was available. This flexibility was crucial. In a world that changed so drastically from year to year, specialization was dangerous. Versatility meant survival. Birds, too, endured. The ones that survived were not the large, gliding species of the open skies, but smaller ground-dwelling or seed-eating forms. Their ability to fly gave them mobility, allowing them to seek food and shelter across wide areas. Their feathers, which had once evolved for flight and display, now provided insulation against the cold. In Theashes of the Cretaceous, they found refuge among fallen trunks and sparse vegetation. They nested in the remnants of forests, building small colonies where the sunlight returned. These birds were the bridge between two ages, the last link to the world of the dinosaurs and the first voices of the new era. Reptiles survived as well, though fewer in number. Crocodiles and turtles, creatures of endurance and patience, weathered the crisis with little change. Their slow metabolisms allowed them to survive long periods without food. They retreated into rivers, lakes, and coastal swamps where water buffered the extremes of temperature. When warmth returned, they emerged to bask in the pale sunlight, unchanged, while the world around them had transformed. Their survival was not innovation but persistence, an echo of deep evolutionary success. Insects flourished again quickly as they always have. Their small size, rapid reproduction, and adaptability made them nearly immune to extinction. They became the engineers of recovery, decomposing the dead, pollinating the new plants, and providing food for everything that followed. The hum of insect life, faint at first, grew louder with each passing generation until it filled the forest once more. It was the sound of the earth restarting itself. In the oceans, life took longer to recover. The extinction had wiped out much of the plankton that formed the base of the marine food web. Without them, fish and larger sea creatures starved. But in the depths, where sunlight had never mattered, chemosynthetic bacteria around volcanic vents continued their ancient routines, producing energy from minerals. These ecosystems, untouched by the impact's effects, became the seeds from which marine life would regrow. Over centuries, plankton species adapted to the new chemistry of the oceans. Once they returned, the rest followed. Smallfish, crustaceans, mollusks. Slowly, the seas filled again. The Earth itself was still changing. The tectonic plates continued their steady drift. Volcanic activity remained high for a time, releasing gases that warmed the atmosphere and ended the impact winter. As the air cleared and the planet heated, the climate stabilized into something new. Cooler than before, but balanced. The old world of constant warmth and humidity was gone. Seasons began to merge, faint at first, but distinct, marking a shift toward the climate patterns that still shape life today. On land, evolution accelerated. The ecosystems were empty enough for experimentation. Mammals diversified rapidly. Some remained small and insectivorous. Others grew larger, exploring new diets and behaviors. Within a few million years, there were herbivores that grazed on ferns and early flowering plants, and predators that hunted them. The age of the dinosaurs had ended, but the age of mammals had begun. Fossil layers from this time show the explosion of diversity. Jawbones, teeth, and skulls appear in abundance, each shaped for a slightly different way of life. Some species developed stronger jaws for chewing tough vegetation. Others evolved nimble limbs for climbing or running. The world was reorganizing itself through survival and adaptation. Every species that emerged carried the memory of scarcity in its body, efficient metabolism, sharp senses, careful use of energy. The new forests were different from the ones that had fallen. Flowering plants now dominated, spreading quickly through seeds carried by wind, water, and animals. They produced fruit to attract disperse, a partnership that would define much of future evolution. The relationship between plants and animals deepened. Where the Cretaceous forests had been ruled by size, these new forests were ruled by complexity. The connections between species grew tighter, more interdependent, more subtle. As the plants returned, the air changed once more. Carbon dioxide levels, elevated by the fires and volcanic activity, began to decline as vegetation captured it again. Oxygen levels rose slowly. The atmosphere cleared, becoming thinner and cooler. The sunlight, now filtered through less haze, was sharper and brighter. It illuminated a planet covered not in giants, but in intricate webs of small life. The scale had shifted, but the vitality remained. It is remarkable to imagine this world, quiet but full of motion. The rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth replaced the thunder of giant footsteps. The air that had once echoed with the calls of massive predators now carried the chirps and hums of insects and birds. Rivers ran clear again, their banks lined with new vegetation. The soil was rich with ash and nutrients, the legacy of the destruction that had preceded it. The earth had changed its voice, but not its song. The survivors of the shadow did not emerge unscarred. Each lineage bore the marks of the catastrophe. The mammals carried the instinct to burrow, to hide, to store, to survive through uncertainty. The birds retained the caution of their ancestors, the quickness to flee, the awareness of sudden change. The reptiles kept their patience, their ability to endure long periods of stillness. Even the plants evolved resilience, seeds that could wait through years of darkness, roots that could withstand drought or flood. Every form of life that persisted after the impact was in some way shaped by that long night. In time, balance returned. Forests spread across continents. Rivers and lakes stabilized. The oceans teemed again with life. The planet, once dark and empty, became vibrant and green. But it was not the same world. The ecosystems were new, the rules rewritten. The age of reptiles was over. The age of mammals had begun in earnest. From this quiet rebirth would come the ancestors of all the creatures that would later populate the earth: primates, whales, elephants, horses, and eventually us. The boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene was not just a line in stone. It was a transformation in the fabric of life itself. Before it lay a world of giants and simplicity, after it a world of intricacy and adaptability. The survivors had inherited a planet both wounded and fertile. The catastrophe that had nearly erased them had also cleared the path for everything that would come after. In the slow passage of millions of years, the traces of the disaster faded. The crater filled with sediment. The ash turned to soil. The bones of the dinosaurs became fossils buried deep beneath layers of rock. But the descendants of the survivors carried their legacy forward, reshaping the earth once more in new ways. The resilience that had saved them became the driving force of evolution. From a distance, from the cold silence of space, the Earth looked the same as it always had. It spun beneath its sun, blue and white, wrapped in clouds. But its surface told a different story, one of death and renewal, of fragility and endurance. The shadow that had once covered it had lifted, leaving behind a new beginning. The survivors of the shadow did not know they were the future. They did not know that they carried in their small, fragile bodies the blueprint for an entirely new world. They only lived, as life always does, from one moment to the next, eating, hiding, growing, adapting. The planet had changed around them, but its hidden pulse still beat, steady as ever, reminding them that even after the darkest night, the earth always finds its light again. And so it did. The forest grew tall once more. The seas filled with color. The air warmed. Life continued, smaller perhaps, quieter, but persistent, resilient, and endlessly inventive. The shadow had passed, but its memory lingered in every living thing. Not as fear, but as proof that life endures, no matter how deep the night may become. When the long shadow of extinction finally began to fade, the first light of the new age came quietly. There was no sudden burst of color, no instant transformation of the world. It began with the smallest things: a patch of ferns spreading across blackened soil, the return of insects to the air, the sound of wind moving through young leaves that had only just begun to form. The earth was not rushing to heal. It was recovering in the slow, patient rhythm that defines everything living and geological alike. The dawn after extinction was more than sunlight returning to the sky. It was the slow reawakening of systems that had been broken. The carbon cycle, the water cycle, the balance of oxygen and nitrogen, all had been disrupted. The fires and the cold had altered everything. The oceans were still adjusting to new chemical compositions. The atmosphere still held traces of sulfur and dust. But the planet had begun to settle. Gravity, wind, and rain resumed their long, repetitive work, smoothing the scars left by the asteroid strike. The world, in its quiet way, was rebuilding itself. In the first years after the impact, the survivors lived in isolation.